The A3 research component is one of the longitudinal research pieces. There's also the anticipatory action research that's being conducted in Somalia, and that is co-led by Simon Levine and Alex Humphrey, with Lena Weingartner, and with our Somali partners, Hexagon. Then Alex is also looking at livelihoods as part of a longitudinal research piece in South Sudan. And then we're looking at livelihoods, conflict, and resilience in Nigeria. If I can get this to go next slide. Lee, over to you.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for everyone joining us. As Sarah said, this is a longitudinal study that we're hoping to sort of maintain over the lifetime of SPARC. Its initial underpinnings began back when COVID-19 started, and there was this rush to understand how it was impacted on both livelihoods and conflict dynamics, and we carried out research across sites in Somalia, South Sudan, and Nigeria. And really, it was although the focus was on COVID-19 and the impact that was having, it was also to answer a broader set of questions to understand what types of conflict individuals or communities are experiencing, what mitigation strategies that they're putting in place in terms of conflict mediation. When we see additional shocks, say climate-related shocks, the impact of those, how does that influence conflict dynamics or incidents of conflict? And also how households are, what coping mechanisms and strategies are households employing to mitigate against both shocks, but also conflict. And then we took these research questions into sort of the next set of or period of research. And as you can see there on your screen, we're now focusing on 2 sites in Nigeria and 3 in Somalia, which we'll go into more details as we explain the findings. But essentially, we're still exploring these questions, and off the back of these, the sort of rounds of interviews that we're doing, there'll be a research briefs that are produced to provide an ongoing update. But also, this data is also meant to be available to the wider SPARC network through our use of OSF. Hand back to you, Sarah.
So, as Lee mentioned, this longitudinal research will be conducted. Panels were trying to attain gender balance of male and females between agro-pastoralist, pastoralist or farming households at the different sites in Somalia and Nigeria. The sites in Somalia had been pre-selected under the COVID research with the anticipatory action group. And so we kept going through with those, although we found in order to find more incidences of more recent being qualified as within the last 10 years, incidences of violent conflict, the villages that were interviewed for our Somali sites had to be a little farther out than those of the anticipatory action group. Within Nigeria, the sites were proposed to us by our FUDECO colleagues based on sort of the livelihood profiles and then exposures to multiple shocks and stressors. We're looking at conducting the interviews once or twice a year, following up with the same households. As Lee mentioned, we initially started as what we'd say a semi-deductive research in which we had identified themes from the COVID round and also from the literature and had an initial set of coding. But this is evolving as we go along with each subsequent round. and the research questions themselves will evolve as we start uncovering different themes and trends and things that we want to pick up further as we interview people. Within Somalia, when the interviews were conducted in fall last year, at that time, there had already been 3 consecutive failed or deficient rains that were already starting to impact the different sites, although the impacts were quite different. And some of that is related to the natural resource bases of the sites themselves. For instance, the villages in Johar district are all located along the Middle Shabelle River. So at that period, they were not yet experiencing significant issues with any water loss because they could still draw irrigation water from the river. But it was also important to note that the challenges that were emerging were very much dependent on the different territorial control challenges and political histories, with Barrow being located in Somaliland, having different sets of contacts and different belonging to different clan family than in Galkayo. Galkayo is a special context. Lee will be speaking more of that. And then the groups within Johar that we interviewed were yet again different, not even within the Somali clan family dynamic. And so all of these and the histories in terms of how things had evolved during the Barre administration or regime more aptly, and the playoff between the different clan families really set up sort of the territorial control scene today and still influences various types of conflict. Joy?
So as Sarah already pointed out, there are several dynamics that also goes into play regarding the issues of livelihood, challenges, and resilience. For example, in the Borao district, we also see these dynamics play out between clans and sub-clans. And in some cases, you have a clan residing in one area, and then there are also minority clans who also now inhabit those areas, but fled due to issues such as internal displaced persons. And also we can see from the findings of the research that these issues regarding clans also plays a role in terms of the livelihoods. So there are various occupations in these regions, but most of them are still agro-pastoralists and mostly pastoralists. And there was also a gender dynamics that was seen in the findings of the research. For example, women are mostly into things that have to do with dairy production, and regarding cattle, dealing with cattle and livestock, smaller animals such as goats and sheep are what the women tend for, and then the larger animals such as the camels and the cows are also what the men mostly deal with. So there's also like a gender dynamics in terms of the livelihoods context. But one thing that was really persistent in the Bora region is the issue of drought. And this issue of drought also leads to disputes also between, not just between the clans and other clans, but also there, even within the sub-clans, questions of water also causes disputes. Then also livestock health is also really very important, because in the situation where there is no access to water, then the livestock also becomes feeble, which in the long run reduces the value of the livestock in the market. Other issues that came into play was also the disruptions that were experienced during election period. Also equally important, it's how these communities like build resilience regarding disputes and conflicts, and also challenges in the community. most important is law, like the customary law. It's like a long tradition that even predates Islam in the region. So it's like a situation whereby the leaders and elders in the community play a very huge role in resolving conflicts. But even more recently, there've been like an increase in terms of business elites getting involved in conflict mediation, because in general, there's a perception that conflict is not good for business. So business elites and also diaspora have also become involved in conflict mediation. One thing that also stood out in the study was that marriage was also used as a way of like victims and perpetrators' families, or a way of strengthening bonds between clans and sub-clans. So I'll hand over to Lee for
I think I got the slides a bit out of order. So I'll jump in with Johar here. Johar is a district in Middle Shabelle. And as I mentioned earlier, the communities from which interviews were conducted are located along the river. So at that time last year, they were not as impacted by the ongoing drought. What was interesting about this narrow band of all the villages from which interviews were conducted were that they were dominated by the Shidlo peoples, which are actually Bantu. And there were, in comparison with the clan families, quite strong differences in terms of occupation, but also gendered roles in occupation. Nearly everyone was engaged in farming and some small animal husbandry, but women and men were equally employed as farmers. And that included working on their own farm, but then also hiring themselves out as casual laborers on other people's farms. And the two reasons given for hiring oneself out was one, due to income and increasing that for the family, but also the major challenge that was listed by the interviewees was a lack of capital to invest in the farms, particularly tractors. And so therefore, there was the need to go help each other in the farms for plowing, preparing the fields. Women were also tending to be the shop owners in comparison with other communities. And some of the men might do trading or work as mechanics. Where we saw pastoralists were the Abgal and Galjasil, I'm pronouncing this horribly, I know, pastoralists who were either transhumanant or nomadic and had been invited by some of the villages to either use some pasture or to sort of a transitory settling in which some of the transhumanant families would establish dry season pasture grazing areas and maintain that within the community. And these pastoralists are from the Issac clan family. The other challenge that they face regularly is flash flooding from the river. And what was interesting, what emerged in some of the follow-up discussions and is something that we're going to be following up, was there was some mention indirectly of the activities of Al-Shabaab, and there was mentioning that some of the flash flooding from the river was not actually due to the river itself, but from unknown actors, but some believe them to be Al-Shabaab coming in and breaching the riverbanks. So this is something that we are trying to follow up with. The farmers mentioned that there weren't any disputes amongst themselves because everyone had clear boundary lines and had established fences. Everyone knew whose property was whom's. Where the disputes arose was with the pastoralists during the dry seasons or with drought, with more pastoralists coming in to try to reach the river. and occasionally then trampling through the fields. There had also been an attack in one of the villages. It was about 8 years back. According to some, others weren't quite certain on the time, in which some of the Abgal pastoralists had actually tried to claim some of the farmland as their own. And this actually caused quite a bit of disgruntlement into the community, because they had invited the pastoralists to use the land, and then to have them try to turn around and claim the land was seen as something that was offensive. The other issues that were mentioned, but this was only by a couple of interviewees, was the presence of the Makawisli militia. And this was a militia formed to fight against Al-Shabaab, but they have been raiding in some of the villages. And then the villages mentioned in the past that they had been caught in the middle when the Johar government would respond and fight the militia. So that could cause damage to them. It was a concern that was ongoing. As I mentioned, relations between the farmers and the communities were peaceful because of property demarcation. They have also established water committees to manage the timing and amounts of irrigation flows. And then they will occasionally work with the Johar District Conflict Resolution Committee when an event goes beyond the capacity of the clan elders.
So the third and final site that we covered was Galkayo. And as the slide is saying there, the main, although there were different subclans in the area, the main they sat under the Dawood clan family, with livelihood practices including livestock rearing, farming, but there was also diversification with small businesses such as shops and restaurants, and selling farm produce to markets. Now, as Sarah mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, the Galkayo site is a special case in the sense that although it sits within the traditional Mugdug region, this region is now split between the Puntland and Gamudug interim administrations, with Puntland to the north and Gamudug to the south. And the interview sites where we carried out our research were on the Puntland side. And this was one, in terms of conflict dynamics, this was the one that appeared the most throughout our interviews, was these existing tensions with militias on the southern side of the Galkayo border. And although at the time there wasn't reporting of violent incidences, the last one that was reported was in 2020. There's still that tension there is still impacting on livestock movements. So the interviews were quite explicit in the respect that they said that if there's drought or they're struggling in terms of pasture land for livestock, they can't cross the border, and vice versa for those on the Galmudug side. It was even when we were talking, or people were referring to traders, so people that had to travel across the border in terms of, in vehicles and trading goods, etc. They were also preyed upon by militias on the Gamudug side. Similar to the other sites, the ongoing drought, is already, having an impact. And, in terms of, I think, linked to the idea of drought and resilience, some interviews were speaking about some members of communities moving livestock across the border into Ethiopia. Now, the limited responses we had to that didn't necessarily report of violence in receiving areas, but they did report, because they were traveling over different areas and long distances, it would then bring them into more contact with with farmland, which that's where you saw the tension. Similar to the other two locations as well, customary law was, I would say, largely seen in a positive light, in particular the roles of community leaders and elders in resolving conflicts. They're very well respected. They're seen, I think, as efficient, but they're also, their judgments are seen as fair, and they're respected as well. The only time that this would break down, and that included across different clans, the only time that this would fail was between clans in the Puntland, tensions between clans in the Puntland side and the Galmudug side. And it was simply stressed that clan elders don't cross the border on either side. So that was the only time that they spoke of where that system was failing. But then what the interviews revealed was that the administration on the Puntland side, and this I imagine is similar on the Galmudug side, but obviously we only spoke to those from Puntland, was that they are increasingly taking a role in trying to resolve the tensions between the two sides. Next slide, Sarah. So our second country context that we're focusing on is Nigeria, and as mentioned in the opening slide, there are two locations that we are focusing on, one in Kaduna State and one in Taraba State, which fortunately we have our colleagues from FEDERCO who can provide, who were leading on the in-country research, and who can provide sort of first-hand experiences because they are from the Fulani community. But essentially, the overall context there is that we are seeing land tenure issues relating to contradictory laws, things like grazing bans, land grabs that are often linked to political elites, and also population growth was mentioned as a pressure as well. Both areas, just the context as a whole, it's I've just described a series of conflict dynamics that they experience. We all know the Boko Haram insurgency, which is now more concentrated in the northeast of the country, but it still affects the country. But we're also seeing more of a focus on farmer-herder conflicts in the central regions of Nigeria, but also northwest, where one of our interview sites is based. There's been an increased attention and analysis now on the increase of banditry that's affecting the region. And both the last two of those conflict dynamics also results in the expansion of vigilante groups, which some see as a positive and thing in terms of the results in terms of reducing cattle raiding, whilst others see it as a negative experience, in terms of their contact with the vigilante group. And this was, our FEDERCO colleagues will cover this, but this was something that arose during the interviews. And on that note, I'll hand over to our colleagues at FEDERCO who can provide you with a bit more context.
Thank you very much, Lee, and good afternoon, everyone. Really good to be here and to see you all. Yes, so our lead researcher for the Northwest, Umar Hassan, sends apologies because he is traveling presently in Taraba State and he couldn't make it. He tried to connect, but he couldn't because he's on transit. So I'll cover Hain Ade and Dr. Zubairu, who is a researcher for the Northwest, for the Northeast, will cover the other research side. So the location Hain Ade is in Kaduna State, in a local government called Bao Local Government. And it is fairly peaceful, well, relatively peaceful, because obviously peace isn't just the absence of war. everybody's affected by bandits, banditry, kidnappings, and all sorts of insecurity issues. But we found that a large number of the pastoralists have purchased their lands, and there are some newcomers from various areas within Kaduna, and also the other states in the Northwest fleeing conflict from there, who are also renting land. But the major challenges we found was that as the population increased, the grazing land is not actually enough for people. And sometimes people have managed just to get a small piece of land for their homes, and maybe for a small farm and for their cattle. So that's an issue which is also affecting other areas. But there's also the issue of stock roads. So the cattle has no way to get to anywhere. So it's a big problem because even what is termed as grazing in Nigeria is actually principally traditional mode of ranching, because ranching in Nigeria doesn't mean it just includes all the cattle in one small area. It means having some fairly larger and flexible piece of land because of water and other issues. There are lots of conflicts as a result, because people sort of don't know how to manage to expand their land or to get more land or to get, stock routes opened for cattle grazing. So that causes conflicts between grazers and people who own farms in the area. There are also lots of land disputes caused by other things, also over water, for example, and people sort of try to resolve these things through various ways. But we also found that the land ownership, that is to say, they don't have secure tenure, basically. So people who bought their land, say 30 years or 40 years ago, still continue to pay the people who sold the land to them and gave them papers. So every 2 or 3 years, the respondents told us that the person who sold land to them comes back to them to say that, look, the value of this land has increased and you need to pay 300,000 naira to stay here, or we'll try to expel you. And what they said is that they have taken this to the local authorities and to the police, but that hasn't worked. So they have to basically pay rents for land that they bought and paid for several years ago. So there's no genuine security for their lands. Even if you have the papers, even if you have a land certificate or whatever, document from the local authorities, it doesn't guarantee you the tenure, because people turn up and don't respect that. And we also found that there's a lot of kidnapping, cattle raids, and also a lot of issues to do with conflicts happening in and around the Northwest, because the Northwest is, as you know, is facing a lot of banditry, especially Zamfara, which is neighboring states in Katsina, and also in Kaduna state itself. Kaduna state itself is the kind of like the most affected by so-called banditry and cattle rustling. So the people there are affected, even though not as much. There's erosion in trust between elders and traditional leaders, because they take the issues of land or other things to the traditional leaders, but they actually don't resolve the problems. They will say to them, go and pay what he's asking, or they're going to send you away. So they find that they can't get any justice from the traditional leaders. So how do they manage these things? I mean, they try to move their cattle to grazing reserves. Some of them are talking of forming militias who sort of to reduce the banditry. But I must also say that these militias are problematic in the Northwest and other places. The Yansa archive group, for example, is very problematic. Research by Dr. Adam Higazi and his colleagues have found that, you know, they are problematic in other areas of the Northwest. But it seems like the people in Hain, they were thinking that this is a good thing. So from the information they were giving us, they felt that having Yansa archives will reduce banditry. So they also kind of like make payments to stay there, give bribes to people to buy their selves and stay in these areas. So there are a lot of issues to do with livelihoods, with conflicts, with income generation. A lot of them don't have regular income generation activities, and a lot of them suffer from huge issues of poverty. So as an organization, we decided to deliver relief aid, which is not part of this research. But because of what we found out, we deliver relief aid to the community at least twice during the research period, because there were, for example, widows who don't have anything. They were making a lot of efforts to come to the interviews and provide us information, and the researchers, the community researchers, felt that we needed to do something to support them, which we did. So yeah, so with regards to Hain Ade, this is sort of like the major challenges and how people are dealing with them. We didn't face any specific serious issues in carrying out the interviews or in doing the work, and they are still looking forward to continue the longitudinal study. They keep asking us. So that's what, in summary, I can say about Hain Ade. So Dr. Zubairo, over to you now.
Yes, thank you, everybody. I hope you are listening to me. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you, Dr. Zubairo.
Okay. Yeah. Good day, everybody. I'm by name Dr. Zubairo Adamu, the lead researcher in Wuro Alaji Idris Abapate. Wuro Alaji Idris Abapate is in Sardauna local government area, Southern Taraba State. And Taraba State is located in the northeastern part of Nigeria. We conducted the research and found out that that area in Sardauna local government, previous governments has already allocated areas for farming and areas for grazing, specifically to Fulani men as pastoralists and farmers known as Mambila majority. There is a tribe called Mambila who are the majority farmers, and Fulani are the pastoralists. We found out that in that area, usually they demarcate their own area. A pastoralist will demarcate his own area either by proper fence or just some form of demarcation as his own land, his family land to graze and some part for farming. But in that land, there is no proper deeds on that land. It's only that yearly, the ARDO, that is their own leader, their pastoralist leader, will come to collect like a license fee or residence fee annually, which is not like a permanent something. So it's an annual renewal fee for using that land. We also found out that there are about 5 major challenges during the study. It started, they were living peacefully with their neighboring farming communities, but something happened in around July 2017 when the Mambila tribes came and attacked the Fulani, who are the pastoralists. It started just like, because the Mambila, they had the political power. The chairman at that time, chairman of the local government, Sadana local government, is from their own tribe. So he gave them the permission to just go and like start to grab the land of the pastoralists in the name of trying to increase their own farming area. How did they do it? They started by saying, okay, there are some minerals in the areas owned by the pastoralists. So they invaded that land and started digging for these precious minerals. When the pastoralists complained to the authority, the answer they gave them is, no, you have the land only, the surface, but anything underneath is owned by the government. So allow them to do their own work. But along the line, they didn't stop at that. When the rainy season came, they planted maize on that piece of land that they confiscated. In that area, the Mambila Plateau, usually if you plant anything, because the animals are allowed to graze freely, you have to put some form of demarcation not to allow the animals to come to that area. But the Mambila, they started the precious mining, illegal mining, then they planted their own maize there, thinking that, okay, this is now their own land, but they forgot to demarcate it, or they don't want to demarcate it. So one night, animals came and grazed on the crops. That started the whole thing. They said, okay, now we wanted to do some small maize. Your animals wants to disturb us. So the next thing is for us to drive you and your animals away. So that led to a major crisis in July 2017. The Mambila attacked all the settlements. There are about 12 major settlements under Alhaji Idris Abba party, and they attacked all of them. It varies anyway. Some settlements tried to negotiate with them and they didn't suffer much. But in other settlements, actually they fought physically and killed some people and maimed some people. So that led to a lot of crises. And that one led to a lot of pressure on pastoralists. Afterwards, the government came in and said, okay, since it's illegal mining, let them leave the place. When they left, they allowed the holes that they dug, and animals usually fall in there. They either died or they injured themselves. The second major challenge is the insufficient water and pasture during dry seasons. Usually in the previous government, before that 2017, there is a time usually they allocate when during dry season, farmers usually harvest their crops. Pastoralists will just go individually to buy these lands so that they will allow their own, they will go with their animals to go and graze on that land. It's a two-way advantage. The farmers will get some stipend from the pastoralists, while the farmer again will then get his own animals to feed during dry season. And bottom, at the end, the farm will be fertilized for the Mambila. So it was a good arrangement. But when the chairman at that time came, he was so tribalistic that he said, okay, he will stop animals from going to those areas so that he will make the pastoralists to suffer. In the course, he just said, okay, that's just for him to stop farmer other clash, which was involved at that time. But that was not the real issue. The real issue is not to allow animals to leave that confined area. And that led to a lot of livestock loss and income for both men and women at that time. The third major challenge is overpopulation and shrinking plots for farming and grazing. Automatically, if you have a finite land and you cannot increase that land, over time, your family will increase. And even if you divide the land among siblings, maybe today they are 7, in the next 2-3 years, they will become 10. and you have to redivide that land again. So there is a conflict, and that leads to a lot of overgrazing. And presently, the Mambla Plateau is facing a lot of erosion because of this overgrazing. The fourth one is this conflict with the Mambila during dry season. You know, during dry season, there is no pasture and there is no water. So these animals has to trek a long distance to find pasture and water. And once they trespass into the farmer's land, they will just take it as a conflict and they have to pay. And if they didn't pay, they will take the pastoralists to court. The fifth major challenge is there are some along the line, pastoralists take their animals to markets, which is maybe their area is close to a major town called Ngroje, and there is a cattle market there. And there's a road that leads to Ngroje. And along this, during that crisis of 2017, the government brought in security personnel, soldiers. And these soldiers used to block the roads along the road from the pastoralist settlement to the cattle market. Not one, not twice, different blocks. They will block it with either logs or with drums, so that whenever a pastoralist comes, they have to request that you pay a certain amount per animal before you leave. Otherwise, you either go back or they detain you there. At the market, the head of the market also has some fees that the pastoralist has to pay. And if they didn't pay, he has to detain the animal again. After selling that animal again, there is one youth organization called Jahum inside the market. Once they see that you have sold an animal, they will demand some certain percentage from you, that they want to protect the pastoralists. But actually, in our own interaction with them, they said they didn't see any use of that one, because they are not there whenever there is any crisis. They just go there to the market and collect these things. But in the final thing, they have some ways of resolving some of these issues. They have their Ardo, that's the leader of the pastoralists, called as Ardo Idrissa Bapate, who is the leader. They usually take their own grievances to him, and mostly he will hear from both sides and try to resolve it. And elders too, in some settlements, if there are different settlements, they will first go to the elders, see if the elders cannot settle it, then they go to the Ardo. But along the line, if all this fails, people usually go to court. Conflicts between pastoralists, that is between the two of them, is easily resolved. But once it reaches the conflict between a farmer and a herder, usually it goes to court. And most of the time, the farmers are the ones that are being, they charge them a lot of money, and they feel a lot of pressure in that type of thing. They decided, the pastoralists decided to form some vigilantes among themselves so that they will tackle this cattle rustling. But in fact, in our own interview, there are a lot of complaints that although there are a lot of cattle rustling going on and the vigilantes are there, they have never recovered any animal. And once, even if you recover it, you have to pay 10% of the cost of that animal, whether you like it or not. So there are a lot of issues in the party that is still unresolved, especially this land issue, where if, say, over a year, the licenses have not been reviewed, maybe because of some political reasons that may come later, we fear that once these licenses are not reviewed, we don't know what will happen. But there are some things that they do, the leaders usually do to resolve this. But we pray that things will not lead to that one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zubairu and Sarli. So, and I know we threw kind of a lot at you, but what we're finding is partially in response to Jeremy's question, the intent was to understand what kinds of shocks and stressors people in the different communities were facing and how they were coping with it. And then drilling further down into some of those shocks and stressors, recognizing that some of that were related to disputes and various forms of conflict. But as we can see across the 5 sites, there are the dynamics are quite diverse and difficult. So we're wanting to see how things evolve with time and place that within sort of a broader political economic analysis, looking at some of the policies, the laws, history, to see how this has been shaping things going on in the different sites, and then tracking how the households are coping, what they're responding to for the immediate pressures that they're facing, but also within the sites in Nigeria, working with FIDECO, also querying about what sort of aspirations the households have, what visions they see for the future in terms of either changes for livelihood or education for their children. So there are rich data sets that we've been collecting and will be collecting throughout, and also quite a bit of a literature. So there is quite a bit that could be cross shared amongst different SPARC themes. Particularly, we've had some discussions with Fiona on this, that land definitely comes into play in all the sites, although in different ways. So these are things that we want to explore. And we're also finding across the 5 sites that also identity, whether you're by your clan grouping or ethnic grouping, can be important for both resilience to your livelihood, but also there is marginalization that some groups are facing. And so it's also questioning what are the limits to household resilience. I'd say that a lot is being placed on households to try and cope with the situation. And in the face of a weak government or lack of, none of the sites have any access to extension services, and there haven't been previous visits by NGOs, what are their options and what are they trying to do and how far can they take it without any external assistance? For there, I'll stop and we'd like to open it up for questions.
Thanks, Sarah, Joy, Lee, Sarli, Dr. Subaru. So if anybody has some, I see some questions in the chat, but maybe we'll open the floor for folks to ask some questions. I know we don't have as much time as we'd like, but maybe we can do a rapid round. Jeremy, if your hand's up, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. And that was really interesting. Thanks to the team for sharing this sort of readout from ongoing work. It's really fascinating to see what's happening in the settings. And I guess my question was really sort of, it was just speaking to what I feel could be useful in terms of having more precision on how you are, deploying this concept of resilience. I was just, in my mind, I was getting confused as to whether we were talking about resilience at a household level, at a community level, where it can mean very different things, and things that can indeed be in competition. And I mean, just to take an example, when we were looking at the last case, I was just from, I think it's Taraba, I was just jotting down some notes. It was just sort of, striking to me how what is a challenge so closely intertwines with what is resilience. So, for example, a challenge is conflict over trespass, but resilience is a formation of a local vigilante group. And what this tells me is that resilience is something that is highly contested, that it is something that's inseparable from conflict, that conflict may in fact be part of how different stakeholders are trying to become more resilient. So I think there's, there's a slippery slope in terms of associating resilience with all things that are peaceful and good, and conflict with, all things that are, compounding stress and negative for livelihoods, when in fact conflict may be a strategy for certain groups in terms of seeking resilience. What contributes to resilience for one group might diminish it for others, for example. What contributes to resilience for a household, for example, such as fencing, might diminish it at the community level. So, you did sort of mention the need for bringing in political economy into this more, and I think that would be very, very useful in terms of just now, critically playing around with some of, these findings. It's very descriptive now, but, I was sort of, wanting to see you now sort of take it to a higher level, and to sort of, critique your own findings a little bit more, sort of interrogate those. And, I guess the question that you are probably asking yourselves now, but going forward is, what might you expect to see across these sites? Each of them sort of show different dynamics in relation to resilience and challenges, as you put it. But the governance settings here are different. The livelihood profiles are different. There are a lot of variables that are different. So, looking across these, sort of what is the bigger insight that you might be looking for? I think it could be helpful to just start, playing around with some different ideas to challenge yourself. This might also uncover different lines of questioning that you can ask in further rounds. But very interesting work. Thanks again for sharing.
Thank you, Jeremy, for your insight. This is something we've been playing around, but a priori, we didn't want to go in with the definition of resilience because we were curious first with the first round of establishing the context and what's going on in the households and how are they defining it both within the individual household themselves and then also within their broader group, how they identified. So we were looking also at descriptions of social harmony or tension, so inter and intra group, and with the intra group within how they defined it within their particular, whether it was a sub-clan in Somalia or between different clan groups, trying to pick that out. So some of these things, it's emerging through time, and it has to be placed within these broader pictures, because as you pointed out, what somebody considers resilience is not necessarily beneficial for others. And this is a question, I think, that very much ties into some of the land issues as well. And it's the questions as well that we do have to break down for what a household considers resilience might just be a coping strategy, and it might not actually be beneficial for medium to long term, in the sense that many of the households are just trying to get by. So there are lots of things that we're trying to unpick, particularly as the situation evolves. We're in the midst of analyzing the second round of data from both countries. In Somalia, the second round that was conducted in March, they'd already then had 4 consecutive failed rainy seasons. And we were already seeing quite a few differences between the October-November interviews and the March-April set. There are also things emerging in the second round at both of the Nigerian sites, particularly related to inflation of inputs and prices that they're having to pay. So it's with this study is watching how things are evolving and what strategies the households are taking and what kind of constraints are being placed upon them, and also their sense of how others within their village are doing, and then whether or not that's impacting any kind of dynamics around dispute mechanisms or conflict. One of the interesting things that we saw, for instance, in Galkayo was that with the severe drought that's been emerging, the interviewees mentioned that there was no time for conflict, that they were too busy trying to just survive. And several of them mentioned that conflict was for the rainy season when things were well and there was something to fight over. So that also points to, I think, a comment that Fiona had about conflict is potentially necessary.
Thanks, Sarah. Really insightful response there. Fiona, over to you, and then Adam has his hand up, and then I think we'll wrap up.
Thanks. Yeah, great to see the beginnings of this presentation of work. And I think, as you've been saying, Sarah, this whole data set is going to be very useful and interesting for everybody to use and in different ways, I think. One thing I was a little bit confused about was when you kind of presented the case studies and you were talking about the causes of conflict. I wasn't so sure whether these were causes that were being presented through the interviews, or whether these were causes that you as researchers had kind of drawn out from the research that you had done. So that was one thing. And then the other thing was that question aside, that the presentation of the causes seemed quite simplified and surface level, and didn't seem to dig deep. I mean, again, the political economy is important here, but didn't seem to dig deep into the root causes of what these conflicts could be. I mean, for example, I heard at one point that poor land management is the cause of conflict, but I think we all know that poor land management is probably more a result of conflict, or a result of many things that might be a trigger of conflict, but it's probably not really the cause. There's probably a whole set of issues, land insecurity, marginalization, behind that. So I think, yeah, maybe it's clearer in the write-up, but I think there needs to be some clearer thought about the differences between surface causes or triggers and deep-rooted causes, and a presentation of these, and who's actually saying that these are the causes, what are the narratives behind this, all this kind of political economy behind conflicts and the other things that you're seeing.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. No, those are valid. I would say it's something that's going to be emerging as the analysis goes along. For the meantime, for the first round, we were taking the interviewees at their word as to what they thought the causes of, whether it was disputes with neighbors, or then distinguishing with violent conflict, asking them what they thought the causes were. But we didn't prompt them in the interviews. It was then, so when we asked them to describe first if there had been any tensions or incidences of conflict in the communities within the past few years, and then asking them to describe what happened and then why they think that happened. So we tried not to lead them into it. And then we are going back and now trying to situate and expand further, because there are quite a few things related to, for instance, within Waro Bapate, the no longer being able to move the animals for grazing is due to the institutions of Taraba's anti-open grazing ban. So there are lots of things that have to be included in the research. I'd say we're still just at the very top.
Okay, shall I go ahead? Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for both presentations. My comments, well, first of all, I think it would be good to talk more about scale. So when we're looking at resilience or livelihoods or conflict, how are we looking at shocks that are coming externally, or are we looking at the local drivers of conflict or of livelihood pressures? So I think if that can be brought out more clearly, it would be helpful, because there are national level problems within, let's say, Nigeria or Somalia, but then there are issues at the state level in Taraba or Kaduna, and then there are the local, there's the local context. So I think to disaggregate the scale of pressures would be very useful. Secondly, the context needs to be maybe brought out more clearly in each case, because like northern Kaduna and southern Taraba are completely different. The Mambilla Plateau, as the Fudeco researchers know, is a highland area. It's mountainous. The pastoral conditions there are very distinctive and completely different to the other case study in northern Kaduna. They could be compared, but the kind of insecurity in both cases is really quite different. So I think, if we're looking at resilience, whether it's in terms of livelihood or conflict, the specificities of each case need to be brought out more clearly. In the Mambilla Plateau case, I mean, the conflict was very severe across the whole of the Mambilla Plateau in 2017, and there was small violence in 2018. But since then, it's been, maybe an uneasy calm and peace. So how has the conflict affected livelihoods and farmer-herder relations and so on in the last 5 years would be a question. And what are the risks of future conflict? So I think, yeah, context, scale, and then maybe also breaking the research down thematically more clearly, I think would be really helpful as well. So those are my main comments. And I'm based in central Nigeria. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, those are all things that we're looking to do with subsequent research rounds. So.
Great. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Adam, Fiona, for your comments. And so I think we're over time, so I think we'll wrap up, but I just want to say thanks so much, Sarah, Sarli, Dr. Agazi, Dr. Zubairu, and Joy, there's Lee. Thank you all for your presentation today. It was really interesting. I think we got a lot of good questions and feedback from the audience as well to take forward. So I think I encourage you guys to stay in touch and keep in touch and collaborate on the research in terms of the production of the research briefs that I know Sarah and your team are working on to be published in September, and then also future rounds. So I think we'll leave it there, but thanks so much, everybody. And we'll share a recording of this webinar for the wider group. And yeah, let's stay in touch. Have a good summer, and we'll see you at the next webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you. Have a good day.